Hi, my name's Alyssa, and today I'm going to do a mid-month wrap-up and share with you, I think, six books that I read so far this month in November and as well in October. I read some of these in October. The first book is Autumn by Allie Smith. The plot of this book surrounds two individuals, an older man named Daniel and then a younger girl, probably in her 30s or early 30s, named Elizabeth, and it takes place in the UK. Daniel and Elizabeth were neighbors when she was just a young girl. This book is very episodal. It has moments of them in the present day where Daniel is not conscious. He's sleeping in a hospital bed, and Elizabeth comes to visit him, and then also has flashbacks to her childhood. And there are also several very dreamlike episodes in the book. Some of them are actual dreams that one of the characters is having, and some of them are sort of more ambiguous than that. The dreams are very surreal and sort of have a stream of consciousness style to them, and that combined with the fact that Allie Smith doesn't use quotation marks to mark dialogue was sometimes very frustrating and hard for me to follow. When I could follow it, I found those passages some of the more interesting ones in terms of just her writing style, but it was also felt like it was walking the line of nonsense as well, and sometimes I liked it, sometimes I really didn't. I really loved the satire of watching this character deal with really like nonsensical bureaucratic system when she's trying to get a passport, but that was pretty much the part that I liked. I had heard this before I picked it up, but also it was really clear within it that it's making commentary and sort of holding up a mirror to our society presently. It takes place in the UK, and I felt like there were parallels about Brexit and the political state. I felt like I got that she was making commentary, but I still wasn't sure what she was saying other than like that this is messed up. It just didn't really feel like she had anything new or interesting to add to the conversation. I found her commentary really subtle in a way that I kept on wondering if I was missing something, and I really might just be too dull to pick up on all of her literary techniques. I'm not sure. There were a few moments towards the end that I felt like things kind of came full circle, and I got a few more aha moments of like, oh, that is a clever reflection that she was making. But for the most of it, it sort of just lacked so much plot and went really slow and was sort of hard to follow, that I don't really feel like I got the reward out of the work that I put into it. Not that it was especially difficult, but I read it almost like 2 weeks ago, and when I went to get the books for this video, I had forgotten that I read this book, so that's not a good thing. Although I do think I gave it 3 stars because it does feel like a beautiful piece of writing. And I think that part of my issues with it were in part just my style and my expectations going into it. Not to start off on a pessimistic note, but I'm going to share the other book that I didn't completely love this month, and that is Your Art Will Save Your Life by Beth Pickens. This was a really short book, and I'm not going to say much about it because it was just altogether really disappointing. Essentially, what I knew going into this book was that the author was an artist consultant in San Francisco, and I expected that it would be insightful to some of the challenges that contemporary artists deal with in the contemporary art world. And from what I had read on the back and some of the statements, that's what I had gathered. There were a lot of statements like this: a necessary revelation, it changed my life, or an essential guide for any artist, things like that. But in reality, this book I found was a how to not lose your mind in the political world today. And it had very little to do with art, the art world, or anything specific to artists. I'll just share with you some of the frequently asked questions for oppressive political climates. There are like 3 pages that are for like anything kind of related to art, and the rest are just really weird. How do I stay woke but also function and maybe even have fun? Is it even okay to have fun? What do I do about my family members who voted for Trump? What should I do about infighting in my activist circles? Some of this maybe applies to some art circles that are especially very activist and involved in politics, but that most of the book had little to do with the art world, and much more to do with politics and really how to like cope as a human being in our political climate. That's not a bad thing, but all of the advice just felt so basic, like an emotionally intelligent adult should just already know those things. This is a library book, so it stinks for them. But my copy actually skips from 62 to 95. So, and I was glad that I had 30 pages less to read. I gave this a 1 star, and I do not think that it was worth your time. I think this is probably the kind of book that hardly anyone on BookTube cares about, but it's one that I read. So on to the next 4. I have 2 short story collections and 2 poetry collections, and I enjoyed all of these more than these first two books that I shared. So first off, I read this at the beginning of October, so it was a little while ago. But this is the first Ernest Hemingway that I read. I should tell you what it's called. It's The Snows of Kilimanjaro and Other Stories. This is the first Ernest Hemingway book that I've ever read, or I may have read like snippets of it in school, but I was really surprised. I have no idea what I was expecting of his style, but I think that I had maybe misplaced him on a timeline and thought that he was a little bit older, that his writing was a little bit older than it actually is. It was not as stuffy or slow or monotonous as I kind of expected it to be. Sparse is a word that I've heard Ernest Hemingway's writing be described as frequently, and I think it's really, really the right word. Sorry if the camera angle just changed, but back to Ernest Hemingway. I found myself having to pay attention to understand exactly what the characters were saying between the lines of their actual dialogue. I also think that this being a short story collection made it even more enjoyable for me. I think I was okay with there being more open-endedness or maybe less of a really strong plot, given that they were short stories. I don't have a lot more to say about him because I don't think I have a whole lot to add to the conversation. I guess I would just add that I found it more accessible and enjoyable than I had expected, and this collection I actually picked up because Climb the Stacks, I think, recommended this as a good place to start with Ernest Hemingway, and though this is the only thing I've read, I would agree. And if you were maybe feeling intimidated by him, I would say it's not too bad and you should try him out. I really liked it, and I can't remember exactly what I rated this book, but I give it a high rating. So my next book and another short story collection is No One Belongs Here More Than You by Miranda July. This is an interesting book. I was familiar with Miranda July as a performance artist. I didn't even know that she was an author. And having studied her in some of my contemporary art classes, I was familiar with her style as an artist. A bit of her work is here on YouTube, and I'll link it down below. If you're at all interested in her, I recommend watching some of her videos to see like a bit of her style. Her voice as an author is extremely consistent with her style and her voice as a performance artist as well. It's interesting, and I really think there's a lot about it that is enjoyable, but it's also just definitely a little bit weird. To illustrate some of the funness, my favorite story in this book is actually about a woman who goes to a random town, and in a town of apparently like 4 people, she teaches them swimming lessons, and they don't have a pool. So she teaches them in their house, and when she sees them in the streets, they're practicing their backstrokes or their butterfly strokes. And it's really nonsensical and weird, but it's somehow really, really fun and entertaining as well. There's a lot of satire in her work. She has a way of presenting ordinary or mundane things and simple parts of life, as well as perhaps the most fundamental emotions or characteristics of humanity or us as humans, and then sort of re-examines them and plays with them, as is consistent with the title of the book. The characters of her stories are often lonely outcasts and bizarre characters. I feel like she's speaking to the outcast parts of us. She uses people that perhaps exist on the peripheral of society to appeal to the parts of us that are peripheral to our own identities. Maybe the parts we don't really want to acknowledge. But she walks the line of showing us something interesting in what we have dismissed or what we try and hide from. And in that line, she sometimes crosses it and makes you feel really uncomfortable. I found myself feeling uncomfortable in parts of this book where the characters really cross the line of what's socially acceptable. It's very hard to explain, and I should probably mention here one of the ways that she uses sort of illustrating that need for acceptance is through intimacy, and there's quite a bit of sexual content in this book as well. A lot of it I felt was a great tool and handled very artistically, but some parts of it were uncomfortably explicit as well. If you want a fun and weird read, I would recommend her. It's very interesting. Like I said, I will link her some of her content that's here on YouTube down below, and I think watching some of her performance art does give you a glimpse into her style as an artist. My last two are poetry books, and I'll start with The Raven and Other Stories by Edgar Allan Poe. I picked this up for Halloween because I wanted something kind of spooky to read. Just as Ernest Hemingway, I don't know that I have anything monumental to add to the conversation. I know that I read The Raven in high school at some point, and it sounded very familiar when I read it, but I had totally forgotten that poem, once I was reading it, was The Raven. I had not remembered it that way, but I don't know that I had read much more than Poe other than that, and perhaps it's just this selection, but I didn't find his writing to be nearly as eerie or spooky or gothic as I had expected it to be, but I actually found it really beautiful. Perhaps at best it's hauntingly beautiful. It's certainly not overly romantic, but it was just really beautifully written. I loved the rhythm and the rhyme to his style. I was just really left wanting to read more, and it was such a short collection. If you've never read Edgar Allan Poe's work before, I would pick it up. It was just really enjoyable. It was not at all inaccessible. I loved it. The last book that I have is No Matter the Wreckage by Sarah Kay. This is a collection of poetry by Sarah Kay, and Sarah Kay is actually a performance artist. I became familiar with her a few years ago when a friend of mine took me to one of her concerts, and I loved her work. Since then, she actually came to my university, which is where I got this book. Oh, and it's signed. I got this book there, and she signed it. See? Wow, I got this in April. So it took me a really long time to pick this up. I actually put it in my closet and I forgot that I had it. But it was a quick collection of poetry that I really enjoyed reading. There were a lot that were fine, but just not really overwhelmingly beautiful. And then there were a few that I did really, really love. One of the things that I also really like about Sarah Kay's poetry is I find it really accessible. She was definitely my entryway into poetry, into enjoying poetry, in part because this friend had introduced me to it. But I find her poems they're not cliche, they're not melodramatic or angsty or overly romantic or angry. They're really about sort of everyday life and everyday experiences, mostly about just her life. I loved the ones that were about New York City. I loved the ones that were about her family and her relationship with her parents or her brother, or reminiscing about moments from her childhood. They're not overly complicated or emotionally charged. They're just really accessible and enjoyable. I think I would have enjoyed some of these poems more if I heard them in performance. There were a few poems in here that I had heard her perform, and so when I got to those poems, I heard them in the rhythm that she had performed them, and I realized how unnatural that was. I'm not sure exactly how to explain it, but in reading, I'd already heard them performed, but seeing them in written form, I realized that I would not have naturally read them in the rhythm that I had heard them performed in. And it made me wonder if I would have enjoyed some of the other poems more had I heard them performed rather than just read them, and whether or not this was just sort of a secondary or inferior medium through which I was absorbing this poetry. I think that the experience would just be enhanced by hearing the author herself perform the poetry. So there you go. There are the 6 books that I read in October and so far this month. I actually have another book that I did finish this morning and a few more that I'm hoping to wrap up at the end of this month. So I'll see you guys in another video. Thank you so much for watching. And actually, if you read any of these and you have thoughts, please share them down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in a future video. Bye.